Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be looking at who's responsible to ensure access to advocacy, which is another way of saying whose job is it to make sure that the people who want an advocate actually get an advocate. So a quick refresh on the learning outcomes that you're going to be asked to provide evidence on. And there's three parts of it. One is about describing who has the duty to inform people of their rights, and then describing who has the duty to arrange advocacy. And then there's, of course, that really important knowledge of knowing what to do if and when those duties aren't delivered. Now, for the learning outcome, you don't need to be an expert in every single type of advocacy. So I'm going to suggest that you just pick one or two different types of advocacy and definitely include the type that you're delivering. So if that's community advocacy, i.e. non-statutory advocacy, I would go to your contract, ask your manager if you can see the part of the contract that explains who's going to be arranging advocacy and referring. Statutory advocacy is what we're going to concentrate in this session, just because there are stricter rules and because it's statutory, which means it's been introduced in law, and there's always guidance attached to that, and that's what we're going to go through now. So we're going to start with IMHA, and this is by far, I think, the most straightforward, because the Mental Health Act explicitly outlines who has to commission it and who has a duty to inform patients. So this is the bit that says who commissions it, and I've just popped this in because sometimes there can be a bit of confusion over whether it's the hospital, or whether it's the local authority, or whether if it's an out of area placement. It's very straightforward actually, and the code of practice is very clear that it's commissioned by the local authority. So I'll just pause for a second to let you read this. Okay. The code of practice also really helpfully places a very clear duty onto the hospital managers and the local authority to provide people with information about advocacy. Now, they might delegate this duty to, the ward staff, but if you're concerned about it, I would be going to the hospital managers and the local authority. And what's very important about what the code of practice says is that the information that has to be provided has to be, it says it must be orally, so spoken word, so verbally explained, and in writing. And you would expect the hospital to provide information about advocacy at multiple points as the person is detained in hospital. And there's a big concern that when somebody's admitted to hospital, they're often given information about the rights when they're very, very unwell. And it's at that moment in time when they're not able to receive the information and take it on board. So the hospital can sometimes sit as a bit of a tick box that, yes, they have given information, but actually the person, it wasn't in a way that was accessible to them at the time. So it's always worthwhile as an IMHA, if you're working, just to check that and to check about the quality of the written information that's often left with people. Now, with mental health advocacy, there's a move towards a system called opt-out. And this is a very straightforward process where the person is automatically assigned an IMHA unless they opt out, by which they say, no thanks, I don't want one, which of course is everybody's right to. Now, if the person lacks capacity to make that decision, then we would use the Mental Capacity Act, of course, and we would follow that framework, and the hospital managers, or the responsible clinician, would need to make a best interest decision on the person's behalf. And the best interest decision is essentially, is it in the person's best interest to have an advocate, to have an IMHA? And overwhelmingly, of course, the answer is going to be yes, because it's about protecting the person's rights and empowering the person to be involved in decisions. Where I think we would need to be very sensitive to not assuming that, making assumptions, is where perhaps the person might not want an IMHA because they're very, say, private, or they could have refused advocacy before, or they might not, they might have expressed a wish not to have any kind of outside people come in. Those types of things might suggest that the person, it wouldn't be in their best interests. Otherwise, most people who lack capacity should be getting an IMHA. And the goal with opt-out is to increase accessibility. And I know we mentioned the research from A Right to Be Heard a lot in mental health advocacy, and it's for good reasons, because it's so significant. And that research told us that a group that missed out on advocacy were people who couldn't instruct an advocate. And that's not right. That's clearly not right, to have a two-tier system that, you know, if you have capacity, you get an advocate. If you don't, then you don't. That's not right. So the goal for opt-out is to just increase the advocacy and accessibility for people. Okay, so if you're worried that IMHAs are not getting to people and people are not finding out about the right to an advocate, the first thing I would do would be to try and identify where the issue is. So is it a problem in a particular setting? So is it in the community? Is it in the hospital? Is it a specific ward where you're having difficulty accessing people or getting referrals? And to do this, we're always going to start with data. So keep records of where the referrals are coming from and who you're working with, because it's only then that you can check where are the gaps. So which hospital wards you're not going to. Then you're going to be talking to the commissioner to raise issues. For Mental Health Act advocacy, I can't recommend this strongly enough that you have a really close kick-ass relationship with the Mental Health Act administrator. I will be making the administrator one of my close allies as an advocate, because that person knows when people are admitted onto the ward, and lots of IMHA services have a relationship with the Mental Health Act administrator, notifies the IMHA service of when people come into the hospital. So get closely allied with the Mental Health Act administration and talk to them about your concerns about low referrals. We've also put here about opt-out, so embed that process. And if none of that's working, then I think you probably need to then go down the more formal routes, raising it formally with your commissioner. And then the last resort will be to seek legal action, of course, and that's particularly important when you're raising issues on behalf of an individual. But if it's on behalf of kind of lots of, you know, a block to getting into hospitals and meeting people in the community, then I'd be getting legal advice on that as well. So that's IMHA. Let's have a little look at IMCA. So this is really straightforward. In England, it's the local authorities. In Wales, it's the local health boards. And that's been since the introduction in 2007. Now, the language of IMCA is different from IMHA. It's also different from Care Act when we come to that. The language of IMHA is the duty to inform. The language of IMCA is there's a duty to instruct. And what we mean by that is that the person doesn't have a choice whether they have an advocate. And that mainly reflects the fact that they have been assessed as lacking capacity to make the decision. So then there's likely to be queries around their ability to instruct the advocate. But it's the duty is to instruct. And the Mental Capacity Act is very clear. It places that duty onto local authorities and or NHS bodies. So it really depends on what the decision is. If the decision is about serious medical treatment, then it's going to be the NHS, i.e. the consultant or the medical professional who's making that decision. They need to instruct the advocate, the IMCA. The NHS body, if they're proposing accommodation for somebody for more than 20 days, then they have to instruct. And if it's a long-term change of accommodation, i.e. more than 8 weeks, that the local authority is looking at arranging, then it's the local authority who has the duty to instruct. And if we think about the language of the Mental Capacity Act, it is a duty, it's a must. This isn't like an option. They have to instruct an IMCA where the person is eligible for IMCA support. Now, there have always been issues, particularly in serious medical treatment, of concerns that IMCAs are not being instructed when they should be. But I think, you know, it's not just serious medical treatment, it's also long-term change of accommodations and also DOLS IMCAs as well. So again, we start with the data, get your evidence, you know, get the information. There's no point going to your commissioner or somebody in power on anecdotal stories. You need hard evidence and data. So get that. Look at trends. Look at how many referrals you had this year compared to last year, compared to 5 years ago, and share that information so that you can communicate your concerns with evidence. Informally, it's always a good idea to do lots of information awareness raising sessions, which I'm sure that you're doing. And of course, linking that to contractual outputs. So thinking when you are going to inform decision makers about their duty to instruct an IMCA. Anything that embeds referring to advocacy within their systems, I think is better, because they don't have to think about it. And then I think on all of these slides, we're going to be saying, if it doesn't improve, raise it formally with the Commissioner. Most local authorities will have a Mental Capacity Act lead. A bit like when you're an IMHA, I will be making the Mental Health Act Administrator one of my close buddies. I will be getting the Mental Capacity Act lead, one of my close buddies, if I was running an IMCA service, because that person will open doors and will have a lot of influence in raising referrals. But bottom line is, if it's a big issue and people are not getting advocacy, then get some legal advice and talk to the lawyers. NHS complaints, very straightforward. Well, when it first came in I think 2004, 5, it used to be centrally commissioned by the Department of Health, believe it or not. But in 2013, it changed, and instead of being centrally commissioned, it went to local authorities. So now it's very straightforward. The local authority will commission it. Now, there isn't any criteria to have an NHS complaints advocate. It's for anyone who would like some support when they're thinking about making a complaint. But the usual allies to help raise awareness will be Healthwatch and PALS and complaint teams. So, you know, it goes without saying, if you're complaints advocacy, you want to be having close relationships with these organisations, and really making sure that when somebody submits a complaint, that the local authority's response, their initial kind of acknowledgement, includes the offer of access and advocacy, so that you can, everybody who's accessed complaints policies knows about advocacy. Care Act advocacy, very quickly, this is another duty on the local authority in England, and we've taken this from the guidance that accompanies the Care Act. And I've put this in because this clearly uses the word must, and we like musts, don't we? Because that means it's a duty. So this isn't optional. They have to do this if the person hits the conditions. And this is where it's interesting, because for IMCA, it's a duty to instruct. IMHA, it's a duty to inform. But for Care Act advocacy, it's a duty to arrange. I don't actually know what the difference between inform and arrange is, because they both amount to the same thing, i.e. the local authority is paying and commissioning an independent advocacy service. But for Care Act advocacy, it's clearly rests with the local authority. Now, there is case law where a lady, an asylum seeker in Haringey, went through, amongst other things, there were lots of issues around housing, but she did go through an assessment, and the lady suffered post-traumatic stress. She had, her English was a second language. There were lots of barriers to her participating in the assessment process, and she should have been offered an advocate, and she wasn't. And I've just kind of summarised here what the judge said, and the judge said that the council was in breach of the Care Act because they should have offered her an advocate and they didn't. And Haringey kind of defended themselves by saying, well, we didn't, but actually the outcome of the assessment would have been the same regardless of advocacy involvement. And the judge didn't accept that. The judge said, how do you know that? You can't possibly preempt the outcome of the assessment. And the judge said to the local authority that that assessment was invalid because it didn't arrange advocacy. And because the duty to offer advocacy couldn't be clearer, that was the judge's words, there was no excuse. So that's really significant, because if you're a Care Act advocate and you're supporting a person through a process, and perhaps they had another process earlier, say an assessment, and they didn't have advocacy, then you have got a door there to push on to say that assessment is invalid, potentially, and they have to redo it with your involvement. Now, I don't think you need to do this routinely, but where it's going to be really useful is if the person is unhappy with the original decision or the original process. I think this gives you a really clear way to challenge that. And that's what's so great about the Haringey ruling, because the judge said that advocate where the person's eligible, then the local authority, they're under a duty to arrange it. And if they don't, then that decision-making process was invalid. Really significantly. Okay, so similar to the other types of statutory advocacy, if the local authority are not providing or arranging advocacy, get your data, so get your evidence, try and work out in which decision-making processes, which areas, is it a particular team, but get that data so that you can go to your commissioner. And one of the things I'd be looking at would be getting data for how many people are going through, say, the assessment process. So the Department of Health, when they were introducing the Care Act, published an impact assessment, and that details how many people they expect how many people they expect to use advocacy. Now, that's really important because you can use that to see in your area. And for assessments, for instance, they expected it would be 6%. So they expected 6% of people going through assessments would have an advocate. Now, you can find out in your area how many people have had an assessment, and then you can find out how many people have had an advocate and work out whether that's 6%. Now, if it's round about the 6%, if it's 5%, that's fine. But if it's 1%, which in some areas it will be, then I think that's a big problem. And that is concrete evidence and concrete data that the duties are not being discharged properly. So that will give me a lot of weight and a lot of ammunition to go to the commissioner and say, look, this is a problem, we need more referrals. Remind the commissioner and remind decision makers of Haringey, because it was such a significant ruling. And then the softer approaches, of course, will be information raising, talk to people involved in processes. So there's a great form I've seen for assessments where on the top of the form, it's got the person's name, and then it says who's supporting the person through the assessment. And then the next question is, does the person need an advocate? Are they eligible for advocacy? And what that question on the form does, of course, is it says to social workers, it reminds them of thinking about advocacy without them having to think about advocacy. It's prompting them, and that's what we want, because it makes it easier. And then, of course, if you're really concerned, raise it formally and then get legal advice if you feel that that's needed. And the final thought for this learning outcome is, you're not under the duty to arrange the advocacy and inform people. That's with the local authority. However, as the person delivering the service, you've got a critically important role. So monitor the uptake of your particular advocacy, compare that with what expectations that there are. Make the referral process uber easy. I mean, some forms I've seen are like 8-9 pages long just to refer, and I look at them and think, bloody hell, I wouldn't fill that in. Make it easy, make the referral form easy. Take referrals over the phone. There's nothing in the Act that says you have to have a written referral form. If you're involved as an IMCA and they need a Care Act advocate, then you just sort that out, after asking the local authority, that's okay. Don't insist. Do you know what I mean? Make it easy, make it really easy. And then where it isn't happening, the bottom line is take action. Don't do nothing. Talk to the commissioner and challenge if need be.